I bought that small house during the housing market crash and lived there for almost a decade before moving into a larger home with my husband. When my parents wanted to rent it, I didn't hesitate to agree, even though it was a decision that could change my life. But one day, just because I raised the rent by $3, I realized that things might not be as simple as I thought. Will I be able to stand my ground in this situation? During the housing market crash, I decided to buy a small house, a decision that, looking back, seemed risky but full of hope. Despite the tough economic situation, I was brave enough to invest in that house, doing it all on my own, with no help and no loans. I lived in that house for nearly a decade, going through many ups and downs. However, as life stabilized and I married my husband, we decided to buy a larger house, one with more space for a growing family. With the small house left behind, I didn't plan on selling it immediately. I had a special attachment to it, and I didn't want to give it up easily. But at that time, my parents started talking about wanting to live in that house. They had gone through financial difficulties, especially after losing their previous home due to an unpaid mortgage. My mom didn't work, and my dad had been retired for a long time, receiving a pension that wasn't enough to live on. They couldn't apply for a loan or sign a rental contract, and I knew that without my help, they would have no stable place to live. At first, I was hesitant, unsure if I could do this. But then I thought about my dad, who had just undergone heart surgery after working hard for 36 years in a physically demanding job. I wanted to help them, especially since my dad wanted to retire and enjoy his old age after a lifetime of hard work. They suggested renting the house with a discounted rent, paying only taxes and insurance, and instead of paying monthly rent, they would pay off the mortgage as a prepayment. My mom, who didn't want to do anything but stay home, also fully supported this idea. So, we made a rental agreement where they would only pay a small monthly fee of $350, just enough to cover the taxes and insurance. Honestly, I wasn't making any money from renting the house. I let them pay off the $50,000 mortgage using an inheritance they received, and I didn't expect anything in return. To me, it was a way to help them without damaging our family relationship. Both my husband and I thought this was a reasonable arrangement, but I never expected that this would lead to complications I could never have foreseen. Everything went smoothly for the first few years. My parents lived in the small house I had bought, taking care of the garden, doing small chores, and overall, things were fine. They followed the terms of the agreement, paying off the mortgage in full and only covering a small amount for taxes and insurance each month. Both my husband and I were satisfied with the arrangement, as my parents were settled, and I didn't have to worry about the house I cherished. Time passed, and things seemed unchanged. Taxes and insurance went up slightly over the years, but that was to be expected. My parents never complained about paying a little more. We maintained a good relationship, and everyone seemed comfortable with what had been established. However, things started to shift one day when I received a notice from the insurance company about a rate increase. Although the increase was minimal, just about $3 per month, I felt it was necessary to inform my parents, as this small amount would affect their monthly payment. They had been living in the house for nearly 4 years, and everything was stable. But I never anticipated that such a simple decision would stir up a storm. When I informed them about the insurance increase, and that the rent would go up by $3, my mother immediately exploded. She lashed out at me, calling me greedy and accusing me of only caring about making money off of the family. She claimed the increase was unfair, saying that she had put so much effort into the house, including taking care of the garden and making small improvements. She even stated that I was trying to make her pay for the house's insurance, which she now considered to be her house. At this point, my father also joined the argument, demanding that I provide all the bills and documents to prove that I wasn't ripping them off. It felt like everything I had done for them over the years, even though it was all done out of goodwill, was now turning into a battle. Despite my efforts to explain that the contract clearly stated they were responsible for the insurance and that the increase was due to the insurance costs rising after many years, my mother refused to listen. She continued blaming me, which left me feeling hurt and confused. In the face of her harsh reaction, I tried to stay calm and patient, presenting all the clear documents I had. But her constant accusations felt like a personal attack. I had given them a home, offered them stability, and now they were treating me this way. The relationship with my mother, which had already been tense, became even more strained, and I didn't know if we could ever find our way back to the understanding we once had. Things became even more tense when my mother continued to lash out about the $3 increase. She refused to listen to any explanation, and every reason I gave was met with harsh rejection. I tried to explain that it was just a small adjustment due to the insurance company's rate change after many years of keeping the same price, but she only saw me as greedy, accusing me of exploiting my family. The situation worsened when she began making threats. She said she would tear out everything she had done in the garden, that all her efforts would be wasted, and that she would no longer tolerate me. One of the things she said that I can never forget was, "This is my house. I don't need to pay another cent." That statement felt like a slap in the face. She truly believed this house was hers, and I was just a meaningless owner. The truth is, the house is still mine, and I am the only one on the deed. But my mother didn't want to understand that. Everything I had done to help them now seemed irrelevant and turned into a battle. Not stopping there, my father also became involved, demanding that I provide detailed bills and documents to prove I wasn't ripping them off. It felt like I was caught in a war I never wanted to be part of. Even though I sent them all the necessary documents, explaining clearly about the taxes and insurance, my mother kept insisting that I was trying to exploit them. The whole family seemed to be sinking into a crisis, and I didn't know how to resolve it. My mother even began threatening to take me to court. She said that one day I would regret this, and a court would side with her. These words not only left me feeling confused but also completely powerless. I had done everything for the family, helped them have a home, yet now I was being seen as the enemy in my own house. The conflicts kept escalating. My mother not only blamed me for the small rent increase, but also began bringing up past grievances, accusing me of not doing enough for the family or neglecting her over the years. I couldn't understand how such small issues could spiral into such a large argument. We no longer spoke to each other as we used to, and the relationship between me and my mother, which had always been complicated, was now more strained than ever. I felt like everything was slipping out of my hands, and there was no way to turn back. This feeling was awful. But I knew I couldn't allow myself to be weak. I had to stand up for my rights, even if it meant facing conflicts and difficulties I never imagined. The situation became more tense than ever when my mother started threatening to divorce my father. She said that if I continued doing this, if I didn't change the way I was treating her and didn't agree to cancel the rent increase, she wouldn't be able to tolerate it anymore and would end her marriage. I couldn't believe my ears. This was no longer just a battle over money or a rental agreement, it had turned into a serious family conflict. My father, the person I had always trusted and felt deeply connected to, remained silent, not speaking up. It felt like he was staying out of it, unwilling to face my mother, even though he was the first person I thought would stand by my side. I called him, trying to convince him to intervene, but he just told me to be patient and resolve the issue calmly. He said my mother was just upset and felt controlled, but I felt abandoned in the middle of my family's struggle. My mother continued to threaten relentlessly. She said that if my father didn't do what she wanted, if he didn't side with her, she would have no reason to stay with him. She had done this before. Divorce threats were nothing new in our family, but this time it seemed like she was serious. Every conversation with her ended with shouting, and I couldn't understand why things had escalated to this point. I tried to remain calm and continue explaining to my mother that I was only doing this for logical reasons, as insurance and taxes were unavoidable expenses. But all she saw was herself as the victim, thinking I was exploiting her over something as small as this. I felt exhausted, unsure of how much longer I could endure these arguments. Meanwhile, my father remained passive, not daring to stand up for me. This made me even more disappointed. I couldn't understand why he stayed silent while I was facing my mother, who was making everything more difficult. It felt like I was the only one fighting this battle, and I began to feel completely alone. Eventually, I decided that I couldn't continue living in this constant tension. I loved my parents, but I couldn't keep enduring this. I needed space to live and build my family's life without being torn apart by family conflicts. This decision felt like a weight had been lifted, but I also knew it would only be the beginning of a much harder journey ahead. In the end, everything seemed to reach a point of no return. My mother kept threatening to divorce my father, and I couldn't bear the tension any longer. It felt like I was caught in a battle no one in my family was willing to stop. I had done everything I could to help them, but now I was the one being blamed. It wasn't just about money. It was about deeper issues, things that had never been addressed between my mother and me. My relationship with my mother had always been strained, but now everything had become more complicated. She kept blaming me for past shortcomings. She could never forgive me for leaving when I was young, for not helping her during difficult times. I felt like all the family's faults were being placed on my shoulders, even though I wasn't to blame. And every time something small happened, all her anger and dissatisfaction resurfaced. Throughout these arguments, my father remained silent. I knew he wasn't a strong person, but I still expected him to speak up in my defense, at least once. But he just looked at my mother, saying nothing. He told me he didn't want to get involved, that it was between my mother and me to sort out. I felt more alone than ever. My husband tried to comfort me, but he couldn't do anything other than stand at a distance, watching me struggle in a battle I didn't know how to win. One day, after a heated argument, I decided that I had to find a way out of this situation. I loved my family, and I didn't want to hurt anyone, but I couldn't live in this constant conflict anymore. I had spent years helping, building a stable foundation for my family, but now I had to think about myself and my own family. My mother might never forgive me, but I couldn't let her continue to control my life. I turned to a lawyer to see if I could terminate the rental agreement without damaging my family relationships. I didn't want to confront my mother, but I needed to protect my rights. I knew this was a difficult decision, but it was the only option I had at that moment. I was ready to stand up for myself, even if it meant facing battles I never thought I'd have to fight. When I told my husband about this decision, he didn't say much, but I could feel his support in his eyes. Though it was tough, I knew I wasn't alone in this journey.